Hello, welcome to CEO Check-in. Today we are talking about how to build a positive culture of feedback in your organization. I know some entrepreneurs think, well, I don't need to worry about that kind of thing until I have a team of 10. But the truth is, even if you just have a virtual assistant or working with 1 or 2 people or 5 people, knowing how to have hard conversations, having a culture of positive feedback, celebrating things that go well, calling out things that need to be fixed, that's super important to the growth of your business and also to building a culture where everyone is rowing in the same direction and getting to success faster. Plus, it helps you enjoy your life more, right? Because if you don't have a way to have those tough conversations, they're probably not going to get had. And then there's going to be a lot of awkwardness on your team. I'm really excited for our guest today, Harrison Kim. He's the CEO of Pavestep. He's a former McKinsey analyst. He's also an investor. He's had wide experience working with top Fortune 500 companies, helping them to build their positive feedback culture. And today we're going to talk about how that applies to small businesses. So before I bring him on, I'm going to share the Go Big tip of the day. And let me just say hello. Oh, hello, Harrison. Glad you're here. Hi, Shelly. Glad to have you with us. So my Go Big tip today is build a positive culture for feedback. And that's in your honor, Harrison. This is exactly what Harrison is going to help us do. But my Go Big tip is build a positive culture for feedback. And what that means is be intentional about having a way for you to share with your team what's working and what's not working. Maybe it's one-on-one check-ins with them. Maybe it's filling out surveys that people can fill out anonymously about what's working and what's not working. Maybe it's having a monthly meeting with each person and going over things that are working, things that are not working. Maybe it's doing reviews with your team. I find this is often missing in small businesses, and we're going to get some great tips today about what we can start doing right away to build a positive feedback culture. Okay, I'm going to bring on Harrison now, and excited to hear as an entrepreneur and also what he can teach us about doing better feedback. Hi, Harrison. Welcome.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
I'm good. It's only Wednesday, but we're getting there.
We're halfway through the week. Hump day.
Yeah.
We did it.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start by having you share a little bit of your entrepreneurial journey, because all of our people watching have built their own small businesses and you decided to take that leap and build your business. So maybe you could share a little bit of your journey and then we'll dive into how to create a positive feedback culture.
Absolutely. So first of all, hi everyone. My name is Harrison Kim and I'm the CEO of Pavestep. And really just a quick story about me, I guess. I started my career as a consultant at McKinsey, and one of the biggest lessons that I took away from that firm was the value of feedback. You know, I used to share feedback with my team members on a weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly basis, and it's really powerful when you have that kind of language and system or ritual in place. I enjoyed it so much that I got inspired by it so much that I ended up actually starting a company called Pavestep. And really what we do is we create the best feedback experience for employees. And on our platform, managers and employees share meaningful feedback with each other in real time. And in addition, we enable leaders to use that data to start making better decisions about their people, instead of relying on annual performance reviews, which are, of course, not super reliable.
And from what I understand, you also keep all the data in one place, which I think is so cool, right? Because we do reviews in my companies, but then we have to go hunt down those documents and Google Drive and everything, where it sounds like people who work with you, they can just log in anytime and find it, right?
Yep, exactly.
That's a cool feature. And when you made your leap to entrepreneurship, how did you do that from like a mindset perspective? Because I'm also a mindset coach, so I'm very curious. Like, what did the conversation in your head sound like in terms of like, should I do this? Should I not do this?
Yeah, I think the biggest question for me that I had at the time, this is after I had thought about the business, what I wanted to do, kind of started thinking about my own savings and my life plans over the next.
Yeah, is this even possible, right?
Right, exactly. So after I kind of got organized and all of that stuff, I think the biggest thing that really enabled me to jump into this kind of journey was deciding, am I ever going to have another chance where I'm comfortable financially and I'm comfortable in my ability, and I think this is a great idea, right? And I thought that kind of moment, doesn't come super often. You just don't know what's going to happen, right? And to me, it was kind of like, all right. And I kind of had a, now or never kind of mindset, whether that's right or wrong, who knows? But that was what really pushed me to be able to do that.
That's fantastic. And look, I have friends who work at McKinsey, and I know that it can be hard to leave that place, right? So, the fact that you shifted your mindset to say, I'm going to go out and be an entrepreneur and provide something that I don't see out there. I assume that was part of it too, that you felt that most entrepreneurs have like, hey, this isn't being done right. I know how to do it. So I'm going to go figure it out. What was the thing that you felt like you could make this big contribution if you started your company?
Yeah, I think, when you think about performance management or performance reviews at most companies, you'd be surprised, but most companies still are using kind of pen and paper or like, Word doc and Excel to kind of process this part of employee life cycle. And one, it's of course very time consuming, and two, it's not very effective at actually developing and motivating employees, which is what it's ultimately meant to do, right? And I thought there was a pretty big opportunity where millennials are looking for feedback all the time. They're the largest generation in our workforce today. And in order for companies to really retain and motivate these individuals, they need to do better. And I thought this was a pretty big area that I could, help solve.
100%. And I would also guess, Harrison, correct me if I'm wrong, but most people are winging it. They're not like trained in how to give feedback. Is that true?
Yep.
Yes. So that sounds like another thing you can help with is like, no, we're going to give you this format. We're going to give you this, template system, etc. And then everyone can be good at giving feedback. All right. This is so cool. I'm really excited for this conversation because, I came out of the nonprofit world. My first company was for-profit. Then I was in nonprofit, and then I started a for-profit. And I think one of the big advantages that gave me is that in the nonprofit world, you can't motivate people with big bonuses and high pay. So you actually have to create a good culture. And part of that was a real intentionality about doing reviews, giving positive feedback. And then I came in the entrepreneurial world and was like, oh, wait, no one's doing this. So I have always tried to incorporate some degree of what I learned in the nonprofit world. And I'm really excited to teach people watching, what can they do? Because you sometimes work with very big companies. Not all of it's going to be relevant to us, right? We're not talking about companies with layers and layers of management, right? In my community. But I would be curious, what are like the 3 things that someone needs to get right when they want to have a positive feedback culture? And feel free to define like, what is a positive feedback culture, right? We're throwing around that term like everybody knows what that is.
Yeah, sure. So to define kind of the positive feedback culture, I would actually just kind of simplify and call it feedback culture. The way I would simply put it is an environment where people feel safe to share honest and detailed feedback with each other, regardless of role seniority, right? So if you think about, there's multiple layers or levels of where you are in terms of maturity when it comes to feedback culture, right? On the one extreme, you've got a company that, or an organization that never shares feedback, right? And then on the other extreme, you've got this psychologically safe environment where people are willing to share feedback with anybody at any time, right? That's kind of what I mean by the positive feedback culture. And a lot of companies kind of fall somewhere in between, of course. But I would say, the latter, kind of that extreme, is how I would define positive feedback culture. And in terms of kind of the 3 things that you talked about, or you're asking about.
Yeah, what would be the 3 things you have to get right if you want that positive feedback culture? And listening to you, I'm suspecting there are people who think they have it, but they don't. Does that happen sometimes?
Kind of, yeah. That definitely does happen.
Yeah, I think a lot of CEOs think, well, if something was wrong, people would tell me, right? Or if they wanted feedback a different way, they would let me know. But usually the boss is the last person to know, right? When things aren't working. And that's one of the important things about having a good feedback culture is if you create an environment where people can tell you what's not working, you can fix it, right? As opposed to people just leaving, or, suddenly people are not doing their job because they're not happy, right? Things like that.
Exactly. So 3 things. I would say 1, sponsorship. So feedback culture, like any other culture or behavior change that you want to create within your organization or implement within your organization, it requires sponsorship. And when I say sponsorship, I'm not just talking about your executive team being like, hey, this is important, we got to do this. That's table stakes. I also am talking about, you're going to have individuals within your team that is really passionate about this stuff, like feedback and their own development. You've got to empower them so that they can hold people accountable, right? You've got to make sure that they are empowered to do that, not just you as a leader. That's number one. Second thing I will talk about is kind of this concept around language. So, and I bring this up a lot, and if anyone's worked with me, they'll be sick of hearing me saying this, but hopefully you're able to understand what I'm saying right now, because I'm speaking English and you understand English, and there is an explicit agreement on what English sentence structure looks like, the words, meanings, and tone even, right? Feedback is exactly the same. Within your organization, you need to have an explicit agreement on what feedback looks like within your team, the cadence, what you're supposed to say, what you're not supposed to say, when you're supposed to say it, maybe even, right? Those things are extremely helpful in avoiding miscommunication. So that's going to be something that's really
right.
important.
And not to just have people randomly giving each other feedback whenever they feel like it. Harrison, my ex-husband used to say, all unsolicited advice is criticism. And he's so right about that, right? It's like, oh, by the way, why are you doing it that way? Like, yeah, that's not how people want their feedback.
Yeah. So if there's like an explicit agreement around how you're supposed to do it, that gets rid of a lot of, these unnecessary emotion or, overly emotionally charged conversations. And so you can actually have a much more productive conversation, right?
Yeah.
And then,
and I'm going to recap for anybody just joining us. Excuse me, Harrison, but I'm with Harrison Kim from Pavestep. He's helping us to build a positive culture around feedback so that you can get feedback from your team and give it to your team in a positive way and keep growing your company in a healthy way, create a strong culture. And so far he said, what are the 3 things you have to do that? And he was saying, 1, sponsorship, which we're defining as find the people on your team who are good at this, who love having a culture where you actually can share what's working, what's not, and enlist them in this. And then the second thing is to use the right language, to make sure you define for your company, what does it mean to give feedback? Just like you might have a style guide for doing your social media or your website, what does the feedback guide look like? All right, cool. And what's the third thing?
The third thing I would talk about is setting up the right processes in place. And when I say process, it kind of sounds a little heavy, but I'm not talking about that. It could be something as simple as holding people kind of, agreeing to share or request feedback once a month, twice a month, that type of cadence, right? It could be something as simple as that. But you should think about creating the right processes so that you're enforcing the right behaviors and the right kind of incentives so that people actually start doing this and it becomes part of their culture and part of their workflow, right? And that's, it takes time, of course. Creating a habit is not easy for really anything, right? And feedback is, I definitely don't think feedback is one of the easier ones. So making sure that... But
that's why you have to be intentional about it, right? So the third one is be intentional and create a cadence, systems, processes. And I'll share just from my own team that we have a weekly check-in with my operations manager. So once a week we sit down and we start with what was great this week. We started all positive, and then we say, okay, what could have been better? We don't say, oh, what went wrong or what failed, right? Again, back to the language, right? We would never ever say to each other like, well, I really hated it when you did this. No, we just say, well, what could have gone better? And then it's an invitation to bring those things up. And I'll just share from our experience that if we didn't have that, there'd probably be a lot of things that'd be building up under the rug, right? That we can catch earlier on and then fix and go into the weekend, if we do it on a Friday, right? Feeling light and clear and like everything's out on the table. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. It could be in a form of a weekly check-in. It could be on a monthly check-in. But I would maybe, spend a little bit of time there around, because a lot of people talk about weekly check-ins and they tend to be much more task oriented, right? If you will, it's like, hey, Julia, let's, last week we talked about X, Y, and Z. I finished X, Y, and Z. This week I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, right?
That's likely right. It's like an operations meeting, right? It's
right.
not like a feedback meeting. But I'd love your advice on what we could do better at the risk of you giving me unsolicited advice that would then feel like criticism. See, I just asked. So now it's solicited advice. What could we do better at our meeting just to make it actionable? And maybe people listening are doing the same thing, just like a quick, we'd probably spend 45 minutes just going over things that went well. And in our case, we more just like compliment in the things that went well. It's not like, oh, you got that task done, right? It's like she might say, well, thank you for thanking me in front of everyone at that meeting. That felt really good. Right. And I might say, oh, thanks for going the extra mile and sending out that, broadcast email after hours. That really meant a lot to me. Like whatever was meaningful to us. And then the what could go better is like, remember that day when you asked me to do those 5 things, but you didn't ask, well, what did I need to not do in order to get those done? Maybe next time you know, put new things on my plate, you could help me figure out what to take off my plate. That's how we do it.
Perfect.
I think open to coaching.
No, I think that's a great place to start. And I think a lot of people listening to this, I'll actually bring up the conversation a little bit higher to talk. I think this might apply for a lot of managers and leaders listening right now. So when you think about performance, you should really think about it in 2 different ways. One is kind of the metrics or tasks or the objectives that you're trying to achieve, right? So it's kind of like what you're trying to achieve. And then the second piece around it is kind of the behaviors or the competencies or the skills that they are portraying, right? Like how they're actually achieving what they're trying to achieve. And for the latter, you know, it's feedback is your data, right? Really more than anything else, right? How you're achieving those things and you giving them that feedback, whether it's positive or, you know, negative, right? And you should really kind of think about those 2 things. And it sounds like from your conversation, just kind of the example that you just gave me, you're covering both. A lot of managers and leaders fall into the trap of only covering the former, which is
let's unpack it for people. Sorry to interrupt, but how am I covering both? Because I'm not even sure I know that.
So because what you just said was around, hey, we did X, Y, and Z. And then on top of that, what you said was, I really appreciated it when you gave me thank you to in front of everyone. That's a specific behavior, right? That's not a specific behavior. Okay, right. That's not a task that, you know, he or she was supposed to do. It was a specific behavior that you did, which showed your ability to show appreciation or develop your team members or whatever it may be, right? That's a specific competency that you have as a leader that she or he gave you feedback on. That's your data point of your quote unquote performance around that, right? So I think when you do these check-ins, and a lot of times, you know, check-ins are going to be more task focused or objectives focused, but I would absolutely recommend having managers at least a monthly meeting around the second part, focused on like, okay, let's reflect back at what we've achieved and how we've achieved it over the last month. And then let's talk about what worked and what didn't so that we can do better next time, right? That is how you get to the better what.
So let me see if I get this straight. Are you recommending maybe we separate the meetings? Like we have an all hands meeting once a week. Most of our team is remote. And I would say for a lot of people watching, maybe most of their team, if not all of their team is remote, especially now with the pandemic. But small businesses tend to have a lot of remote people, right? Virtual assistants, people in other states. So maybe there's one meeting where you go over, okay, what's on your list? How far did you get? Are you stuck on anything? And then a different meeting where it's like, well, maybe it's just my, you know, very female interpretation of like, well, how did it feel? Right? That's what I feel like the meeting is about with my operations manager, where we do the feedback, because a little bit like the love languages, you know, the 5 love languages, you're probably familiar with that. They have them for personal, but they also have the 5 love languages for work, right? What if the person I hired, like my operations manager, is a different personality type than I am? I'm a massive extrovert. I'm a huge words of affirmation person. You know, what if for her feeling thanked looks different than what I think she's going to enjoy? That's part of why we do that whole feedback thing.
Yeah, makes sense. And it's helpful to get on the same page around those types of dynamics early on, right? One of the things that, you know, good, you know, managers used to do back in one of my, you know, previous roles, was literally as soon as you get on a team and you meet this person for the first time, they ask you, when do you want your feedback and how do you want it? Right.
Oh, I love that.
Right.
Oh, most of us are not doing that. Wait, say that again. That was just huge. No one's ever said that to me.
it's when do you want your feedback and how do you want it? Right. So
what are the choices? Like, what if they're like, I don't know, what are you talking about?
You think about like, okay, do you want feedback right then and there? As soon as you do something, you want me to give you feedback right then and there? Or should we put in a calendar invite for every Friday to sit down and have a structured conversation? Right.
I love that, Harrison. That right there is gold, because I will share with you that when Alyssa came on, and she's fine with me talking about all this. Thank you, Alyssa, for letting me share all this. That I was someone who was like, wait, let's not do it that way anymore. And right in the moment, I was giving her feedback, and she asked me, can you not do that? Which of course I could not do that, right? And we save it for that weekly meeting, and that made a big difference in our relationship. So exactly what you're talking about, so valuable.
Yeah, 100%. It's really helpful. It's kind of similar to like sprint meetings, right? A lot of people are like, hey, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this throughout the week? And you're like, no, let's have a meeting every week. And then let's have those sprint cycles where we can actually work on the things and not context switch or anything like that, right? So that can be a very powerful thing to agree on.
What do people get wrong? Let's go right to the stuff people screw up. So like, you're a consultant, you've helped hundreds of businesses, large and small, have a good feedback culture. What's that thing you see over and over again where you're like, oh, if only they would all stop doing this?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that people make mistakes on when it comes to feedback is it kind of not thinking about the relationship and how that could affect that conversation. So let me kind of be a little bit more clear. So there's obviously a whole bunch of research and frameworks around how to share feedback in a more meaningful way, right? And a lot of the times people will actually kind of follow that, thinking, oh, this is kind of the golden rules, and as long as I'm following it, it's all good, right? But at the end of the day, those are guidelines, right? The way you're going to have your interaction, whether it's the content or the delivery, it's going to depend heavily on the situation as well as the relationship that you have with that person, right?
Well, especially if you're their manager or their peer, right?
Exactly. So kind of thinking about that dynamic and thinking about like, hey, what is my relationship with you today, right? Maybe I'm totally fine giving you constructive feedback over email or over electronic. Maybe you don't like that. Maybe I need to be more aggressive and more direct, or maybe I can be very pulled back and he or she will know, right? Like those are also things that you should kind of think about before delivering that feedback.
I think that's really, really valuable. Thank you. And how does all this apply to remote workers? Because I think that's on people's minds right now. Maybe they had a good feedback culture when it was in person and everyone's, hanging out, having lunch sometimes. And,
right.
You have that non-work time when you could bond. And a lot of that is gone, sadly. What are you seeing out there in terms of feedback culture during remote times, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, it's an amazing question. So in the remote environment, there aren't those organic moments, like you said, where you and I are walking back from lunch and I'm like, hey, can we just have a quick feedback session? And I would love to get your feedback from my presentation this morning, right? Like those moments are kind of gone for the most part because everything is scheduled, right? In our calendars these days. So the way I would think about that is, when you are thinking about feedback in the remote environment, like you've got to have a clear kind of communication process, right? This, again, comes back down to having that explicit agreement on the cadence and the delivery method and things like that. For remote work, just like anything else in remote work, you need to have an explicit agreement on like, hey, because we don't have those organic moments anymore, let's make sure that you and I catch up every week, or you and I literally have a blanket time on our Friday afternoon to make sure we devote that time for, sharing and requesting feedback with each other, whether it's through a system, through a meeting, it doesn't matter, right? Especially for a small business, to kind of start there.
That was your step 3 that you recommended earlier, was to have the processes in place, right?
Exactly.
Because it's not going to just happen organically. And, you also talked about language, which I love. I'm trained in NLP, neuro-linguistic programming, which teaches the importance of how you label things, right? Because if you say, I'm starving, right? That's different than like, oh, I kind of feel like a snack, right?
Yeah.
And so with feedback, like we don't call that session feedback. The session that I do with my operations manager, we just call it check-in. Because I think if you say to someone, oh, every week we're going to have a feedback session, like that sounds miserable, right? So I don't want to do that. So what language do you recommend?
Yeah, it's a really funny question because it really depends on how you grew up, right? Like if you say feedback to me, I actually take that as a very positive word. And I know that's not, I think, the norm.
I don't think that's the norm.
Yeah, I don't think that's the norm. What I would recommend is, I don't think there's a silver bullet kind of word that can replace feedback that works for everyone. I would really ask internally. I mean, every company is different. Every people, and strategy are different. I think trying to figure out like a word that works for you and your team members, I think is going to be most helpful
That's a great idea.
Kind of
and now that you say that, we did come up with that word together.
Right.
So yes, that's a really good point. But whatever it is, just to have that placeholder. For us, it's once a week. And I'll be honest, because sometimes we miss it. So if it winds up being just twice a month, not every week, that's okay. But if it's not there at all, then I think things just build up. And the truth is, there's a lot at stake for CEOs, because if you're not in lockstep with your team, especially when you have a small growing team, right, things can get off the rails pretty quickly. And you also want people to enjoy coming to work, right? Which that can decrease pretty fast, right? If they're feeling not heard or angry about something that happened 3 days prior. So let's go back to that question of what are people screwing up? Because I think there's more good stuff there.
Yeah. The other thing that people tend to make mistakes on is not being clear on Well, actually, I was going to say development feedback versus evaluative feedback, but I think that actually applies more for larger organizations. Why don't I talk about kind of for smaller organizations? I think the common mistake is thinking that you know what your people want, right? Like this is like a really interesting thing, and the only way to, I mean, let me put it this way: if you are any manager or leader, right? I personally think it's very difficult for you to fully transparently understand what your direct reports are really motivated by, right? Because
unless you're a mind reader,
right?
You have superpowers.
Even no matter how close you are to that person, you're still a quote unquote manager or quote unquote boss, right?
Yes.
And as we all know, that's ever reported to somebody, like you can't fully be transparent for certain things, right? It's hard, I mean, right? So kind of take that thinking out of your head, right? If you're a leader, be like, okay, I'm not going to know everything about this person, because a lot of the times people don't share feedback because they think the other person knows, right? Because they're like, oh, we're in good sync that I don't need to do this kind of feedback and ask for feedback. That's a big mistake that people make. And then one person out of their 10-person team leaves out of the blue, and they're like, what happened? And that's 10% of your workforce, right?
Right, and that's when you find out all the things that you weren't hearing that you could have found out in those feedback sessions and maybe addressed.
Exactly, and honestly, you're not even probably going to find out everything, even at that point, right?
Yes.
So trying to discover that more and more, and like just getting, moving yourself away from thinking that you know what motivates people is going to be a critical component when you have these sessions.
That is a great recommendation. I love that. And you're just dropping so many truth bombs here. This is super, super helpful for our people watching. So thank you, Harrison. I did want to ask you one last question, which is, I know you talk about doing top down and bottom up feedback. And I'd love to hear you explain what that's about, because we have a lot of women with fast growing companies. Maybe they have a team of 10, but next year they're going to have a team of 20. How do you implement that, and what does that mean?
So I think when you talk about top-down feedback, it's the typical, manager to direct report type of feedback. And when you talk about bottom-up, I think you're talking about kind of the upward feedback. And for a lot of leaders, feedback, again, it seems easier to do the top-down, which I think makes sense. And it's almost, that is your job as a manager. You need to do that. But in order to encourage bottom-up, I would really think about a few things. One, you need to have upward feedback because you have huge blind spots. Like, especially as younger entrepreneur, like more junior entrepreneur, more new entrepreneur, you just don't know your blind spots, right? You
and
just
not trained in management, not trained in management, right? Yes.
Like this, especially if this is your first role as a manager or for startup, like you need to cover those blind spots. And number two, when you actually actively ask for feedback from your junior employees, what that creates is the actual role modeling of the culture that you're trying to build. If you can give feedback to your CEO, there's nobody else you cannot give feedback to, right? Like, let's think about it that way. So to really role model and create that feedback culture, the CEO asking for feedback can be very powerful.
That's a great, great tip. And I think something a lot of people skip is figuring out how to get feedback from people at all ranks of their organization, from, the VA all the way up to the person right underneath the top dog. Well, Harrison, I've learned so much today. Thank you so much for joining us. If people want to continue on this journey about learning how to have a positive feedback culture, where can they find you? Any resources you recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. They can find me at pavestep.com. That's our website. You can reach me at harrison@pavestep.com. And we have a podcast called Working with People. So feel free to check that out too.
Oh, yes. Thank you for the reminder. I forgot to say that in my intro. I listened to a couple episodes. Fascinating. So yeah, check out Harrison's podcast. One more time, Working with People, right?
That's right.
Love it. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. I loved having you on. I think it was your first Instagram Live. How did you feel?
It's good. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. I loved having you. You did great. I'll see you soon. And thanks again for sharing all those great tips with our community. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Harrison. If you press off, then I'm going to stay on.
Perfect.
Super. So I know that sometimes we think, well, I'll figure out all this stuff about feedback when I have, a bigger team or when the company raises venture capital, but it's never too early to have a positive feedback culture in your organization, even if it's just you and a virtual assistant. Trust me, that virtual assistant is seeing things that they would like to share with you. Maybe has ways they wish you would talk to them or assign tasks that you're just not going to be aware of unless you solicit that feedback. That's that bottom up we're talking about. And if you want to learn more about how to be a manager and how to onboard teams and make sure they're successful, we do have a masterclass starting. One of the main things we teach is how to go from being a doer, where you're the one doing everything with a very small team, to being a leader. And part of being a leader is knowing how to solicit and give feedback in a positive way. I hope you learned some great things from Harrison today. I know I did. If you want to find out more about Masterclass, just go to the link in my bio. We are enrolling right now. If you're watching this 4 months from now, we may not be enrolling right now. This is May, but we are enrolling right now. Anyway, have a great day. I look forward to bringing you more guests and doing live coaching here on CEO Check-In. And in the meantime, stay brave and go big. Have a great day.